Now, if you're thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, didn't Alex just review a 2015 MDX last year? You're right, but 2016 brings a few changes to the MDX and a definite reason to see this model again. Not too much has changed up front for 2016 because the MDX was one of the first Acuras to receive this new modern front-end design with this multi-module LED array. The outside 3 modules are used for the low beams, the inside 2 are used for the high beams. Now, these LEDs do not steer in the corners like you do find in the new Volvo XC90. The front grille that many people complained about in previous generations of the MDX or other Acura products is a little bit reduced in this generation of the MDX, and I think that overall the front-end design is aggressive and attractive, not cartoonish like we did see out of the MDX with that large shield grille. The MDX is a solid 3-row crossover in terms of overall size. This is 10 inches longer than the Acura RDX, which is their 2-row crossover. This is also longer than the Lexus RX, which is also a 2-row crossover, but it is about 3 inches shorter than the QX60, which is Infiniti's large 3-row crossover. This also manages to be just about 1 inch shorter than a Volvo XC90 for 2016. Now, although we do get this window line that drops down here towards the rear like you see in 2-row crossovers, the overall rear profile stays fairly upright, and that's to give those 3rd-row passengers a little bit more headroom. The rear end design of the MDX is elegant and a little bit more exciting than some of the entries out there like the Audi Q7. We do get these light pipes integrated into the rear tail lamp modules, but you will also see that the rear glass is actually a little bit more sloped than some of those 3-row crossovers out there, and that does have an impact on rear cargo room. Under the hood is one of the areas we see a big change for the 2016 model year, but it's not the engine. This is still a 3.5-liter direct injection V6 engine producing 290 horsepower and 267 pound-feet of torque. What's new for this year is actually a brand new transmission. It's a ZF 9-speed automatic. That 9-speed automatic is basically the same transmission that we see in a variety of different Chrysler and Land Rover models. Just like the 2015 model, the 2016 can be optioned up with Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. And SH all-wheel drive is fairly unique in this segment, because even though the MDX starts as a front-wheel drive vehicle, if you add all-wheel drive, the all-wheel drive system can send up to 90% of engine power to the rear axles. The Infiniti and the Volvo can only send about 50% of engine power to the rear axle at any time unless there is front wheel slip. And that unless the front wheel slips is the key here with the Acura system, because this system can do it without front wheel slip. In addition, Acura employs a torque vectoring rear axle which can send up to 100% of the power destined for the rear axle to a single rear wheel. The MDX is not as aggressive in sending power to the rear or across the rear axle at higher speeds as it is at lower speeds. So for instance, if you're on a very tight winding mountain road going say 10 to 15 miles an hour, and you're in a tight corner and you push the accelerator pedal down on this, you can get the rear end to kick out a little bit like you would get in a rear wheel drive vehicle. If, however, you're going, say, 40 to 50 miles an hour and that corner is a little broader, then this actually will be relatively indistinguishable from the Volvo XC90. So it really depends on the speed you're going, because the speed you're going really affects the way the super handling all-wheel drive system directs power around. Front seat comfort comes in at 7 out of 10 points. We do have a power tilt telescopic steering column in our top-end model, but this top-end model still only has a 2-way adjustable lumbar support, and we don't have any adjusting thigh cushion. Those are things that you are seeing now in the 2016 Volvo XC90, as well as the Lexus RX. The Volvo and the BMW score top marks in this segment for front seat comfort. BMW's X5 can have their optional sport seats where you can actually change an awful lot more of the seat shape than you can in most other vehicles, like the curvature of the seat back itself. Second row comfort is excellent in the MDX. I'm going to give this 8 out of 10 points. These rear seat bottom cushions are not too close to the floor, and I do have a decent amount of headroom even in our sunroof equipped model. The second row seats also recline, although the range of motion is not as large as you'll find in some, and these seats do move forward and backward to help you apportion the space between the second row and the third row a little more equitably. Now if I move over to the middle seat, I do have a little bit less headroom here because this seat is a little higher up than the outboard seating positions, and my hair is brushing the ceiling, but it's not touching the ceiling yet. Very much like the Infiniti, but different than the current generation Volvo, is that the plastics quality does drop a little bit as we go towards the rear. So we have more hard plastics back here than we do up front, although our model does have these very nicely integrated rear window shades which pull up out of the door and lock right up there at the top of the window. Two areas where this specifically falls behind the brand new 2016 Volvo is right here in the back seat, because this is a 60/40 design, not a 40/20/40 folding design. And the middle seat belt actually comes out of the ceiling, not the seat back itself. That means that it is dangling out of the ceiling. If you are using it and you do need to get into the third row, it makes it a little bit less convenient. If you put a child seat right here in the middle seat of the MDX, you will notice that it is skewed slightly to one side because of the positioning of this shoulder belt. Now, that slightly different child seat position is going to happen even if you use the latch anchors. And the MDX is quite unique here in that it has 3 sets of latch anchors across the back for child seats, one for this middle seat as well. Except that even that latch anchor is also skewed slightly towards the driver's side, meaning that child seat won't be sitting right here in the middle of the bench. Getting in and out of the third row is extremely easy with these electric sliding second row seats. Just press that button, the front seat folds and slides. You can also escape from the rear with a button right here on the seat back. Getting in and out of the third row seat is fairly easy. Again, we have those electric moving second row seats. Does make getting in the back a breeze. Now, we don't find as much headroom back here as we find in the new 2016 Volvo XC90 or in the Infiniti QX60. The QX60 is based on a Nissan Pathfinder, and that is a very large 3-row crossover with a very square rear end, and that does give you excellent headroom in the back. That means that if we scoot the second row seat all the way back in its tracks and lock it back into place, my knees are definitely digging into the seat right here. I do have to crane my head to one side in order to sit upright. Although the MDX is obviously not the largest 3-row crossover, cargo room in the back is actually fairly good, and that's because it seems like Acura prioritized cargo room a little bit over third row passenger room. That means that we can put a 26-inch roller bag back here in this position and still close the hatchback. Now, of course, the third row seats do fold completely flat with the cargo area, as you expect out of basically every 3-row crossover out there. That does mean that you can push the luggage right over there on top of the third row seats. Very much like Volvo, Infiniti, BMW, and basically everybody else, you can tell that Acura intends you to keep that third row flat most of the time for your cargo area, because that third row area is actually trimmed more like a cargo area than a passenger area. Now, under the cargo area load floor, we do have a very deep storage well. That means that you can actually put a 26-inch bag or 24-inch bag in the upright position behind the third row seat and still close that trunk. Taking a look around the interior, we have this standard sized sunroof, not a panoramic model like we find in some of the competition. Height adjustable seat belts for both the driver and the front passenger, and these very stylized Acura seats that I find very attractive. These kind of remind me of that Lady Gaga music video, Born That Way, with these very high shoulders. We have height adjustable headrests, and of course we have perforated seats in our particular model because we do have heated and ventilated front seats. You find a little bit more hard touch plastic on the front doors than we see in some of the competition, with soft touch plastics on the upper side, a soft armrest right there, and then hard plastics below that. Although real wood trim is available in certain Acura models in certain world markets, in the United States and the MDX, this is imitation wood trim. We do have a soft touch injection molded upper dashboard and then soft touch lower dashboard as well, with a very large glove compartment. It is sort of a slot style glove compartment right there on the passenger side. We have essentially the same infotainment and navigation system that we had last year. If you want to know more about this particular system, go ahead and click that banner at the bottom of your screen. You'll be taken on over to our dedicated infotainment review. We have a single center channel speaker right here above this large screen. And in a nutshell, this is a 2-screen infotainment system where the large upper screen is used for navigation and certain other feature entries, leaving this bottom screen for more direct human interaction. This is a touchscreen right down here, and this is where you control things like your heated seats, certain climate control settings, the audio source, that sort of thing going on right here on this screen. But the 2 screens do work with one another. So if we're navigating our media device, for instance, you'd actually be using both screens for that. Below that touchscreen, we have our start-stop button for the engine. We have the controls for that infotainment and navigation system, controls for our dual zone climate control as well, with an auto button right over here. Since we're in the model with the rear seat entertainment system, we have a rear power button right over here for that system, single slot optical display right here with an eject button, then a small storage cubby right here with a 12-volt power outlet. Continuing on down, we have basically the same shifter that we first saw in the Acura RLX. It's this button arrangement. Press the button for park. If we want reverse, we pull this button backwards and it now lights up here to show us that we're in reverse. Neutral, we press this button right over here. Sport or drive, we press this one here. It toggles between those 2 modes as we press it. You get a little circular light right there. IDS is the integrated dynamic system. This allows us to choose between normal, comfort, or sport, and that changes the way the transmission and the engine behave. And then we have this start-stop enable-disable button because our model does have that optional start-stop system. One of the nice touches with this button arrangement is that, for instance, if we were to just turn off the vehicle, like we press this power button right over here on the dashboard, you'll notice this shifts the transmission automatically to park. To the right of the shifter, we do have 2 very large cup holders. I had no problem fitting large takeout drinks inside. Between the 2 front seats, we have this very large and very practical center console. This is made possible by the front-wheel drive design of the MDX. So we can lift that armrest, we have a very small storage cubby right there, or we can lift up the next tier and you can see that we have an incredibly large storage bin behind that. Now this is actually one large storage bin, and this is a divider that you can slide forward and backward. We have little rubber grips right there to help keep your smartphone or other things from sliding around. We can actually lift it up to see this entire storage bin. This is where we find our auxiliary input, USB input right there, an additional 12-volt power outlet, and this bin is large enough to easily put a gallon of milk inside. Over on the driver's side, we have a very typical Acura instrument cluster. This is very similar to what we see in the rest of the Acura lineup. We have two large dials for the speedometer and the tachometer, and then these smaller physical gauges for the engine temperature as well as the fuel gauge over here on the right. We do have a large multifunction color display right between the two that gives us things like our trip computer information as well as the status of our super handling all-wheel drive system if your model is so equipped. That multifunction display is controlled via this knob on the right side of the steering wheel. We have a trip button right over here. This knob scrolls around and clicks down to enter. The steering wheel is an attractive 3-spoke design. You can see we have a single spoke right down here at the bottom, and it's very similar to what we see in other Acura models. You'll find paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel. We have down on the left and up on the right. The biggest difference between 2016's 9-speed and 2015's 6-speed automatic transmission is first gear. First gear in this transmission is right around 20-to-1. The 6-speed was right around 15-to-1 or so for the overall effective ratio. With a much deeper first gear and much faster shifts than the last transmission, that means that we actually go from 0 to 60 considerably faster. 6.1 seconds in this vehicle, that's about a full half-second faster than in 2015. That also means that this is actually a full half-second faster even than the BMW X5. That would of course be the BMW X5 xDrive 35i, which would be the approximate equal to this MDX. This is also about 0.4 of a second faster even than Volvo's brand new XC90 with their turbocharged and supercharged engine and its 8-speed automatic. Now again, the big difference is that low first gear that we have in this car. If you leave this car and drive, by the time you hit 40 miles an hour, you will have used more gears than the 2015 model even had. Unfortunately, the 9-speed automatic has nothing to do with braking, and so I'm going to give this a C+, because braking distances are a little bit longer in this than in some of the competition. Fade resistance also isn't quite as good. Now, the longer distances really have more to do with the tire size that we get in the MDX than anything else, because the Volvo XC90 in certain trims now gets pretty wide tires, to be perfectly honest, and you can get very, very wide tires in the X5 and in the Audi Q7. Even though many of those models actually weigh more than this MDX, those wide tires really compensate for that an awful lot. I'm going to give handling an A-. The MDX does very well for itself when you consider the tire size that we get here yet again. Now, the Volvo XC90 actually handles a little bit better than the MDX because it actually has a better weight balance. This has about 60% of the weight up front, 40% of the weight out back, and that really is obvious in neutral handling situations where the front end resists turning an awful lot more than the competition. So if we're out here on these sweeping curves like this, you'll feel that the car doesn't want to turn quite as much as the BMW or the Mercedes or even that Volvo actually. This feels a little bit more like the Infiniti QX60. Now, the Acura has a trick up its sleeve, and it is this super handling all-wheel drive system, because it can send more power to the rear than the Volvo XC90, and it also has a mechanical torque vectoring axle. So if I were to apply power in this corner here, then it would actually be shuttling power across the rear axle, helping the car rotate a bit more in the corners. So that means this car has a very different power off and power on feel. Power off, this feels more like the Infiniti QX60, but power on, it actually feels more like the BMW X5. When it comes to the ride, I'm going to give this an A-. This does have a traditional steel spring suspension setup. Now, you can get an optional air suspension in the Audi Q7 as well as the Volvo XC90, and those would get A+ for me. However, I think this suspension is a good balance between handling prowess and a decent ride. If you take a look at something like the Infiniti QX60, it is very soft and very comfortable, but it really affects the handling an awful lot out on the road. Acura had been accused of making a fairly loud MDX out on the road, but cabin noise has definitely dropped in this generation of the MDX. Just like the 2015, cabin noise comes in at an A- for me. We came in at 69 decibels, which is only a little bit louder than the BMW X5. The X5 was actually surprisingly quiet in this category. This is right about the same as the Volvo XC90 or even the Infiniti. The one thing this 9-speed automatic transmission does not help with is fuel economy, and therefore I'm going to have to give this a C. We've been averaging 19.7 miles per gallon in the MDX over the week that we've had it, and that is notably lower than you find in the Volvo XC90. Now, I have to say I was still a little bit disappointed by the fuel economy in the Volvo XC90 with a 4-cylinder engine under the hood. I would have expected a little bit better out of it. However, I wouldn't expect any better fuel economy out of the upcoming Audi Q7, which is also going to be getting a 4-cylinder engine. You'll also find right about the same fuel economy in the Infiniti QX60. Now, instead of a small turbocharged engine, the Infiniti gets to that high fuel economy with a CVT, or continuously variable transmission. Now, because the Infiniti is large and it is using a CVT, Infiniti also had to reduce the torque rating on that V6 engine. So it definitely has to rev up an awful lot higher than most of the competition out there. This 9-speed automatic really is the defining feature of the MDX, because this is the only entry in this category that uses this transmission. Now, this transmission is made by ZF of Germany, which is the same company that makes the 8-speed auto that we find in the BMW X5. However, this transmission behaves very, very differently. I have a separate video on my channel about this ZF 9-speed automatic transmission in detail, but in general, this transmission just doesn't behave the same way because it's designed very differently. This transmission uses a type of clutch when shifting between certain gears that requires the engine to be completely disconnected from the equation. As you're going from gear 1 to 9, there are going to be 2 gear shifts that feel very differently from the rest, and that does throw people a little bit off. Of course, on the flip side, we do have that greatly improved acceleration. Personally, I think that's an acceptable trade-off, and I think that you will eventually get used to the way this transmission shifts, but you should know that if you're out there test driving this, especially if you're test driving it back-to-back with the Volvo or the BMW, which, even though the Volvo is still a front-wheel drive based vehicle, actually feels more like that BMW in terms of shift quality. I should also comment on Acura's latest safety systems in the MDX. I do have a separate video that goes into complete detail on those systems. However, in general, these systems are a little bit more interactive than we find out of the Volvo XC90. Now, this does have things like collision mitigating braking assistance. We also have radar adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance that's very aggressive. However, we don't have things like pedestrian detection or the low-speed autonomous driving system that we do find available in the XC90. In addition, all of Volvo's systems, and actually the majority of the European systems, tend to be a little bit less interactive than what we find here in the Acura. And by that I mean that this system, if we turn on the lane keeping assistance system, is always providing some feedback. You can think of this sort of as a ball in a raceway, that the assistance to keep us in the lane line actually increases the closer we get to the lane line, but it's always doing something. So it always feels like there's someone tugging on the steering wheel gently when you have this mode engaged. It can feel a little bit disconcerting out on winding mountain roads. In addition, the collision mitigating braking system is active at all speeds, not just at low speeds like we find in a lot of the competition. This system is simply the result of differing priorities at Japanese companies in general and at European companies in general. European companies tend to take a more hands-off approach. They'll warn you about things, but you have to take the action or initiate whatever it is to try and correct the problem. The Japanese systems, and that includes the Infiniti and to some extent Lexus models, they tend to be a little bit more proactive, a little bit more interactive with the driver, always suggesting things when the system is enabled. Of course, you can disable this system as well. Pricing for the MDX is a little bit more complicated than it has been in the past, but it is still easier to explain than many of the Europeans. That's because Acura still prefers options packages to standalone options, and the options lists on basically every other entry can get fairly extensive and fairly complicated to explain. Things start out here at $42,865 for the V6 engine and front-wheel drive. The front-wheel drive nature of the MDX is a little bit different than before because previous generations were all-wheel drive only. If you want to add all-wheel drive, it's available all the way across the line for $2,000. Also available basically across the line is Acura's $1,500 Acura Watch package, which combines all of their latest safety systems. We have collision mitigating braking, auto braking, road departure mitigation, lane departure warning, lane keeping assistance, adaptive cruise control, and collision warning. Now that package is available on basically every model except for the top end trims where it becomes standard. If you want factory navigation, the cheapest one is going to be $49,290 because it also brings a few other options like the rear sunscreens with it. The next step up is $49,290 and that adds heated rear seats, sunshades, and the rear seat entertainment system. The advanced package is $53,080 and adds the idle start-stop system, ventilated front seats, as well as a few other options. If you fully load your MDX with all-wheel drive and basically everything, you end up right around $57,080. BMW's X5 is obviously a solid competitor in this segment. Unlike the MDX, the X5 starts, of course, as a rear-wheel drive vehicle. This starts as a front-wheel drive vehicle, so the dynamics of those base models are going to be very different. The MDX with super handling all-wheel drive is going to be about $10,000 less than a comparably equipped BMW X5. Now obviously this won't have real wood trim on the inside like we do find in the BMW, however just about everything else is going to be fairly equal. Under power, the MDX can actually feel a little bit more nimble even than the X5. The X5 can feel a little bit heavy and a little bit soft at this end of the food chain. Of course, there are top-end versions of that X5 that there is no accurate comparison for. So if you want the V8 engine in the X5, if you want the X5M, obviously nothing in the Acura portfolio is going to compare to those BMW models. The QX60 is very similarly priced to the MDX. It is a little bit bigger, especially back here in the rear passenger area, where the MDX's overall profile means that we have a little bit less passenger room. Like the other luxury options, you can get real wood trim inside your QX60 in the United States. The QX60, of course, is equipped with a CVT or continuously variable transmission, and it has less power. That means that although the fuel economy is going to be better than the model we're taking a look at here, it's going to be a lot less exciting to drive. The chassis over there on that Infiniti is also considerably softer. So if you're after the best ride in this segment, that would be that QX60, not the MDX we're taking a look at right here, although this is going to be an awful lot more fun. The CVT in general means that the QX60 is likely going to be a little bit less reliable than this Acura. However, of course, the new ZF 9-speed transmission has gotten off to a rocky start, so we really don't know what long-term reliability will be like. Unless you need that third row room, I would take the MDX over the QX. I think that the interior is a little bit nicer in this, the driving dynamics are obviously an awful lot more exciting as well, and this is definitely faster. The Volvo XC90 for 2016 is probably the toughest competitor for the MDX because they both play in this area that is in theory a little bit below BMW and Mercedes. Volvo's previous generation XC90 I think actually compared very well to the MDX, but the new one is completely different. Volvo is obviously reaching much higher than they ever have before with that new XC90, and you can find much more luxury on the inside than this MDX right here. You can find things like real wood trim, a stitched leather dashboard, we get softer leather, a heated steering wheel, a more adjustable driver's seat, we get top-end Bowers & Wilkins sound system options, and we also get things like a full four-corner air suspension. Now on the downside, we only find 4-cylinder engines over there in that Volvo XC90. It's 4-cylinder turbo and supercharged all the way. Power is a little bit higher than we get in this MDX, but actually it is a hair slower to 60. The rear seats are a little bit more cramped in the MDX than we find in the Volvo or the Infiniti, but the Infiniti is still tops in this segment unless you go up to that next size category. The Volvo will cost you between $2,000 and $4,000 more than the MDX, but we do get slightly better fuel economy, again, more options than we can find in this model. However, Volvo does leave out a few things, like we don't have those electric folding second row seats. We also don't have a rear seat entertainment package. Volvo instead says you can just use your own iPad. The 9-speed automatic that we find in this MDX is a little bit different than the 8-speed that we find in the Volvo. Volvo's transmission is a more traditional automatic transmission in terms of overall feel, and this definitely has a different feel, especially during gear changes. Even though this MDX does have cylinder deactivation and the Volvo uses that complicated turbocharged and supercharged setup, fuel economy is still better over there in the Volvo. Now in general, Volvo's reliability has not been as good as Acura's, so I would expect the maintenance and overall repair costs on this Acura to be less expensive than the XC90 long term, especially if you do get that 4-corner air suspension. It's going to make the XC90 ride incredibly well, and it will give you that extra off-road height lift that we don't get in this model, but it could be expensive to repair in the long term. Handling is definitely better in the XC90, largely because we get some seriously wide tires front and rear. Even though the MDX can be a little bit lighter than the XC90, and we do have that torque vectoring rear axle, it's not enough to compensate for wide, grippy rubber all the way around. That means that overall in this particular segment, I would put the Volvo XC90 tops. I'd put the Acura MDX a very close second. Again, it really depends on what you're after. If you're after that expected reliability long-term, the MDX is probably the better choice. If you're leasing your vehicle, if you just want all those luxury features or the better handling or the very, very attractive interior, then I would take that Volvo over this model. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes. This has been the 2016 Acura MDX. Be sure and find me over at Facebook and at Twitter, and I'll see you next week.